All right, Nick, per usual. Guess what? I do have a joke. And here's my question for you. Why did volunteers get fired from the nonprofit juicing factory?
Ooh, I don't know.
No? Well, turns out they couldn't concentrate.
Oh boy. Woof.
Welcome to the Using the Whole Whale podcast, where we learn from leaders about new ideas and digital strategies making a difference in the social impact world. This podcast is a proud production of Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's go learn something. This week on the nonprofit news feed, we have a bunch of news per usual affecting the nonprofit sector. Well, we're talking about atrocities in Sudan. We've got some more ridiculousness from Twitter, now X. Bernie Sanders has a plan, and even more about the American nurse recently kidnapped. So how's it going, Nick?
It's going great, George. We want to start the podcast off today talking about a story that may not have made the top of the headlines over the past couple of weeks, but is worth your attention. And that is that humanitarians are sounding the alarm on conflict and atrocity in Sudan while donors fall short. So aid groups and international organizations are increasingly sounding the alarm and putting up warning flags on the humanitarian cost of the conflict as Sudan's civil war rages on. So on April 15th, 2023, fighting broke out between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, which is a paramilitary organization. These two entities were united as part of an anti-democracy regime that came to power during the 2021 coup, but ruptures have emerged with civil war, violence, ethnic cleansing, threatening humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. So in critiques written by experts over at the New Humanitarian, international donors have fallen short, pledging just half of the $3 billion that the United Nations estimates is needed to address the crisis. And international NGOs and aid groups are warning about severe obstacles of providing aid, including safety concerns, lack of bureaucratic cooperation from the bureaucracy in Sudan, and severely limited humanitarian entry points via limited ports. So analysts call for international NGOs to refocus those efforts because of the difficulty in access on local, on-the-ground community efforts. So it remains to be seen how effective that response is. And George, something I think we want to talk about with our viewers is that this is happening in Sudan and has created millions of displaced people, refugees flowing into Egypt, South Sudan even. And you might remember that in the 2000s, this conflict is a vestige of the mid 2000s, the 2004, 5, 6 violence and genocide in Darfur. And we wanted to highlight in this podcast, we did some Google Trends research, the really sustained search interest around Sudan and Darfur in 2004, 2005, and 2006 in the United States. And it's really stark when you juxtapose that search interest compared with what's happening this year, in which we had, following the coup, we had a civil war break out in the capital city. And we saw a huge spike in searches that dropped off almost immediately. And now search interest around in Sudan, Darfur, Khartoum has completely leveled off as if nothing's happening. So George, this is something that we've been talking about on this podcast, which is the limited window that organizations have to entice donors. Here, it's on a bigger scale, right? It's the limited window that you have to entice governments, to politically motivate governments to solving problems. George, it seems that the attention span is just getting really short across the board. What does this mean for nonprofits and NGOs?
Well, this is something that I think for each organization, it's very interesting to be able to look back. And again, we're on google.com/trends if you're following on YouTube. And what we're seeing is sustained interest, certainly spikes of Darfur coming back to 2004, finally petering out like years later, but a lot of up and down there. And even for the Sudan, there was peak interest in and around January in 2004. Google Trends basically shows you searches for interest as a proxy, right? Like if more people are searching for it, more people are probably looking for news and other pieces and other mentions. And we can change that also to news searches, and we get something somewhat similar, although it's a little less data in there, much more about Sudan as a reference. So using web search as a proxy, you're right. This sort of, I'll go with goldfish-like attention span to international incident is quite short. I can't tell because of the amount of factors to sort of put it on one. Is it like overall reduction of ability to hold national attention when it happens also matters? Let's not forget we're also bombarded with regular Ukraine, Russia updates of international, and it's like we have a certain appetite, I think, as a country for this kind of thing. If I narrow the window down a little bit, you get in just even the last 12 months, because sometimes it can look a little shallow looking at it, that it really was a single spike and done. So unfortunately, there's going to, if there is another monumental newsworthy incident going on, reporting is probably what you also need here, of getting these stories out to the public of what's going on, rather than a wall of silence. I think it's also interesting to see for international aid for organizations how that money is being distributed. I still just believe you need the folks like Global Giving and other international organizations operating here. But it seems like the way that they implement their funds is what they're saying. If I'm reading between the lines, is that it's hard to get in there. So don't create a new footprint, but rather work with local organizations. And I think it's a little risky actually to have direct American donors give to what sounds like reputable local on the ground organizations. Like I'm in this, and I couldn't even say like, how would I qualify, a reputable local organization on the ground? So you still need that operating international NGO layer, I think.
Yeah, George, I think that that's exactly right. And you cite a major concern. Access is actually a huge issue in the country. It's violent. It's it's very dangerous. And this is a country that's still dealing with sanitation and hygiene concerns. Like it's a humanitarian emergency on top of a humanitarian emergency. So it creates whole layers of difficulty. But I think you're right. I think that international organizations are probably working with on the ground partners, like providing resources. A lot of the big NGOs have like implementing partners, right? So they have on the ground organizations that they'll disperse funds and resources to. So George, to your point, if you're listening and you're thinking, what can we do and donate to this? The answer is essentially those local on the ground organizations are going to need to be on the front lines of this because there's some of the few with access. But the way to do it may still be by giving to some of the big NGOs that have that infrastructure to safely and kind of with accountability, hopefully have that downstream donation to getting boots on the ground, not boots on the ground, donor dollars on the ground essentially. But the other layer of this, and I think it's interesting to talk about, is actually the information ecosystem is really, really challenging. And it may be as simple as one of the reasons we're not hearing a ton about it is because it's really hard to get information out of the country. One aid organization that was cited in the new Humanitarian article said that they were stationed in nearby Chad. It's been weeks since they've been able to get reliable communication with their own staff in country. So that's how difficult it is for information and news just to get out of the country. So there's a fundamental infrastructure problem. But I think this is something that we want to keep top of mind. We talk a ton about really, really big humanitarian issues on the podcast because that environment also affects local NGOs and nonprofits and humanitarian emergencies in the news, whether it's Hurricane Katrina or the Haiti earthquake or the crisis in Ukraine actually do have an impact on how the public perceives and interacts with charities and nonprofits, I would argue, in general. And trickle-down effects, refugees. There's now tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees in the United States, right? The trickle-down effects impacts are there. So I think it's important to bring these stories to our listeners. But George, I actually want to take us into another international story. And this one comes from Haiti. We've talked about Haiti on the podcast. It's really been, again, a humanitarian emergency on top of a humanitarian emergency. The government has, in all effect, collapsed there. But Alex Dorsainville, who was associated with a nonprofit doing ministry and aid work in Haiti, was kidnapped with her child, and the State Department is now involved. The U.S. State Department had previously ordered the departure of non-emergency government personnel from Haiti as the security situation deteriorated, and the U.S. Embassy in Haiti advised nationals to leave the country immediately. So this has happened before. We've talked about high-profile kidnappings of missionaries and aid folks, many of whom, especially in Haiti, or the ones that are kidnapped, happen to be related to ministries, faith-based organizations, etc. George, what do you make of this? I mean, this is a nurse from New Hampshire, nursing, providing nursing care for children with this organization.
Yeah, I think the kidnappings in areas like this are probably more common than not, but it happens to be a U.S. citizen, and so we're taking national attention. Look, I think if you're a nonprofit sending people into conflict zones, I think you have to be very cognizant of what you're asking and the actual risk. I mean, if the U.S. Department of State is basically saying you should be pulling out, I think you're frankly putting folks at more risk than you should, and I think that probably won't be criticized here. You have somebody who's doing God's work for this church in Haiti. That's fine until it's not, and the now attention resources that need to be deployed in order to make sure that your nonprofit is sending people into conflict areas when they shouldn't. Is now a national crisis. So this is a tough one. I really hope that she's all right, obviously, and maybe brings attention to like, oh my gosh, if it's that unsafe there, yet you still need this much international support and aid, and with the increase, frankly, of natural disasters coming at a time like this, Haiti is definitely on the front lines of another potential hurricane as we move into hurricane season. So I think the security needs to be considered in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs when you are deploying something. And if it's not there, you can't have traditional aid deployed, especially from US-based nonprofits where US citizens are literally targets because they know that there's money attached to them some way. I don't, it's above my pay grade though to say like how does that resolve in a way that doesn't perpetuate the fact that like, oh, let's just keep kidnapping Americans because we get big checks. It's a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one. I think when you listen to folks, humanitarian folks and politicians, the history of aid in Haiti is really, really, really complicated. There's been a ton of mismanagement, violence perpetrated by UN peacekeepers, et cetera, et cetera. But it's some of those same people who've been criticizing international aid, particularly 10 years ago in the wake of the earthquake, but as well for decades before, saying the situation's actually so bad that we might have to revisit that option again. So it's really sad to see, but I agree with you. It's a complicated situation, particularly for aid organizations on the ground, in which, that decision of whether or not to pull out, to go in, et cetera, when you're providing life-saving aid, but putting lives at risk is a really hard challenge. All right. I'm going to take us back to home from our international stories. And this one comes from mainpublic.org. And it is about the endorsement of Bernie Sanders of a plan to create a nonprofit electric utility in Maine. Bernie Sanders is not actually a senator from Maine, a senator from Vermont, but has endorsed the idea of Mainers being able to vote on whether to buy out the assets of Central Maine Power and create a nonprofit company with an elected board. So I guess we're not privatizing power, but we're non-profitizing power. George, what do we make of this one?
I found it super interesting, and it was just sort of hidden in amongst articles, but it's a very potent potential structure for power, which is, very much becoming like that human right of access to the internet, access to power, access to heat. When you get into the public good, I'd say power is up there. Frankly, I'm in California, and PG&E has got a woeful record of doing things like maintaining power lines while, taking advantage of California citizens on price pieces, and also manipulating solar markets here. It is something that I'd be curious about, because frankly, the direction of a company, the purpose of its being, is shareholder value. How do I make a giant margin on this? Now, for a public resource, like, I'm very curious of what that looks like when it's stakeholders, the public. That said, nonprofits are not the cure-all in terms of a structure. You can still have corruption embed within it, because the humans, look no farther than our ongoing topics around healthcare and nonprofit hospitals that are going on. So by no means is it a fix, but you at least add levels of potential transparency and a higher likelihood, hopefully, to reinvest in the infrastructure, which this country is desperately behind on any measure you want of energy grid that is close to this century and or has the best interests of the public, I would say, in mind. And maybe that's a harsh take. I'm also not super teed into the main power network and troubles. But it was curious to see. And if you're digging into it, it's the Pine Tree Power's campaign manager said Sanders should give Mainers confidence. Getting this endorsement from Bernie helps to show that our plan to create Pine Tree Power Company has both been constitutionally vetted and vetted by people who know it's good for working people and not shareholder profit. So kind of interesting.
That it is. I have never been to Maine, and I've always wanted to go. So maybe now this jolt to the system will propel me to go there. Talking about power in Maine, but power in Maine, George, we have to talk about the main character of Twitter these days, which is, unfortunately, Elon Musk. This story comes from 13newsnow.com, but is reported everywhere. Musk is threatening to sue a nonprofit that actually researched hate on Twitter. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate publishes reports tracking hate speech, misinformation, etc., and has been paying particular attention to what's been happening on Twitter. But Musk lashed out at them, threatening to sue them. This comes as Musk has rebranded Twitter, which is, I guess, no longer Twitter, into X, the letter. George, it seems like a mess over there. I think that I don't even really know what to say other than Musk seems to kind of be like a kid who's kind of gets what he wants, and there's not a lot of people to tell him no. But suing nonprofits for doing social media research, that's not, in my mind, acceptable, especially Facebook recognizes the need to research and, is much more engaging on this. Musk's attitude towards misinformation and harm and disinformation is just so blasé. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to watch someone do this amount of mental gymnastics where you're this much of a free speech advocate, yet when that speech is against something you do, you'd like to use the power of the law to silence them. It's hard. I mean, that's Olympic level gymnastics. And hats off to you. That's an impressive mental feat. I hope he does push through. I hope he brings the hypocrisy to the higher court and watches what the legal system does to another $1 billion. What does it matter to the guy? I think he should stick to rocket science and leave social science alone.
I think that is a good tagline. I guess we have to talk about it. George, what's in nonprofits? You're a nonprofit social media manager. What are you thinking right now about Twitter, X? Do you leave? Do you not leave? Threads? What the hell is happening? What do you do?
Yeah, so currently we also added a new resource on Wholewell that sort of tracks the Twitter, now X, versus Threads. Threads clearly had 100 million in the first week adoption. They're now, the dust is settling and we're seeing like a little bit lower than a 50% retention in terms of usage, yet it's very feature light. And so now they're going to be adding in more elements of features, a higher seems like pull through of content between Threads and Instagram. So other things that are leaning a little bit still more towards Threads is that they haven't even implemented a desktop application. There's now limits of content access on Twitter of scrolling, a limit of 1,000 tweets per day. And there's longer video length on Threads, which is interesting potential as a video piece. The character limits are different. The 500 character count limit on verified Twitter users have a maximum of 280 characters. Verified who pay $8 a month get 25,000 character limit. And I'd say it's a very shaky platform, frankly. And X is a shaky platform. And Threads is completely unproven and it's not clear how it will develop. I would say to play around and experiment on it is worthwhile. Locking in your account, certainly connected with Instagram, makes a whole lot of sense right now. In terms of engagement, it depends on the niche that you're playing in, but there is a definite positive algorithm bump, it seems, to more uplifting or positive type information than Twitter, which is, seems to decay toward rage. The rage posting and ability to like engage that conversation, but only because you have the back and forth of left and right fighting. So I would say that's currently where we are, watching closely on that retention number. Frankly, if you can't retain them, it's pointless. It's a sinking ship. But Facebook has a lot more arrows in the quiver, it seems, for doing this. And Elon's ability to consistently step in it is impressive. And so he is doing that platform zero favors. And there's no other, if you're going to talk about Discord, it's too niche. If you're going to talk about Mastodon, it's too eclectic. There's just no other Twitter killer out there like Threads right now. So worthwhile paying attention to it.
Yeah, no, George, I think that's a good analysis. I think also it's a little bit of, it's still developing, right? It's a wait and see how this all shakes out. I don't even know, did Threads exist last year? Was that something that Zuckerberg's been planning, or is it just kind of like a, hey, I see an opportunity. How quickly can we get this thing up? And boom, now here it is.
No,
I don't really know, but
it was a skunk works. It was like 20, 30 people just hustling to do it. It was only last fall, and yeah, he was planning. He saw the opportunity to attack, and he has either sort of he has stolen, I'd say, every single part of that platform systematically, but he's really good at executing. And that's a difference. You don't have to have a single original thought if you're good at execution. you can do a lot. I think it should also be noted that there's far more folks in terms of trust and safety for Facebook. I mean, literally, they're openly releasing llama models, which are these trained LLMs, large language models, to the public onto platforms like Hugging Face that anyone can access. Right? They have the ability to do very, very, very intelligent AI, machine learning, and more importantly, trust and safety work with those tools. While unclear Twitter. Elon's pretending like he's going to create an AI company next because that's the flavor of the week. But my trust sort of in Facebook's ability to manage the moderation task that a large network is far superior than on Twitter/X.
I agree. Facebook has infinitely more resources. Even they have a global infrastructure for trust and safety, which we can talk about. Definitely deserves criticism, but at least in the year 2023, those systems are far, far superior to almost any other platform, really, at this point in terms of robustness. But George, I want to take us away from the sinking ship that is Twitter in the tweet storm of their own creation, and bring us to a piece of good news in our feel-good story of the week. And we want to talk about a Utah nonprofit called Jump the Moon, which is propelling artists with disabilities, such as muscular dystrophy, forward with adaptive technology. So this article from DeseretNews.com highlights how artists are able to take advantage of Jump the Moon's innovative, almost like jerry-rigged devices that folks who are in wheelchairs or have other disabilities can also produce art. And we love art, and we have some really cool, bright, fun arts and some bright smiles in this article. So a feel-good story to cap off a pretty intense podcast episode.
Yeah, really clever innovation here for making art accessible, and really cool pieces, actually. You should check that article out. All right, Nick, per usual, guess what? I do have a joke. And here's my question for you. Why did volunteers get fired from the nonprofit juicing factory?
Ooh, I don't know.
No? Well, turns out they couldn't concentrate.
Oh, boy. Oh, goodness. Okay. That was the worst one, but I enjoyed it. And I don't know what that says about either of us.
Well, that's what you get for making it to the end. Although I've been putting the jokes at the beginning now, so you can't escape them. I'm trying it out. I'm like, oh, that's a funny piece. All right, Nick. I'll see you out there.
All right. Thanks, George.
This has been Using the Whole Whale podcast. If you want to keep learning more about these topics and others, head on over to wholewhale.com/university to keep learning with us. Thanks as always to GregThomasMusic.org for his tunes that underwrite our tracks. They're fantastic. Hope you're doing well, Greg. And just a reminder, subscribes really help us on any platform that you listen to us on. Please give a thought to click and subscribe, and maybe even a comment, because we like hearing from you.